So, I wonder how you feel about this time of year, autumn. All the beautiful leaves changing colours on the trees, all the amazing colours of the fireworks lighting up the sky. It was amazing last weekend, wasn't it? We had Diwali first of all, then bonfire night, and the fireworks were absolutely incredible. And when our children were younger, we used to have a tradition of going up to Southall Railway Bridge, and you got the panoramic view on every side up there. And I asked Naomi Ruth for permission to show this photograph of her, because every Diwali she used to put on her special favourite brightly coloured hat and go running down Southall Railway Bridge pretending to be a firework. We had lots of fun. But here's where I have to admit that last weekend, when the fireworks were still going on night 3, the celebrations of the first night were beginning to wear a bit thin for me. I was feeling exhausted, I was lying in bed, and I began to feel quite angry at the disruption to my sleep. I lay in bed brooding on it, and at around 1 o'clock in the morning, this would be last Sunday morning, I had a moment of clarity which changed my whole perspective. Because into my mind came the memory of a documentary that I'd watched about some families living in Syria who'd stayed on because they were medical people and they wanted to continue to treat people who were injured during the conflict there. They had the opportunity to flee for safety, but they made that choice to stay. And I remember there were scenes of nighttime when the families would be in their home. My memory is that the electricity wasn't working and there were loud bangs and explosions around them. And they had no idea if the next bang was going to be a hit on their home, on their family. And in that moment at 1 in the morning, I started to feel grateful. Grateful that as the fireworks exploded noisily out on the green of Norwood Green, the only threat that I was facing was a threat to my sleep and not my life. And I remembered a friend of mine who lived in Southall but used to live in Afghanistan, and she really struggled when the fireworks were here in Southall because it took her back to her time in Afghanistan when there'd been a genuine threat to her safety. And there are many in our local community who fled situations of conflict and are living with the aftermath of trauma. I remember there was a lady who used to phone Dave and I up in the middle of the night at all sorts of random hours because she had never been the same since a B-2 bomb had landed near her home back in World War II. And it's right that we remember the particular horrors of the First and the Second World Wars. And this Sunday, Remembrance Sunday, I invite you to remember the trenches, the trauma, the tragedy, and the triumph. Or to put it another way, loving our past neighbours who gave their lives for our freedom. Loving our present neighbours who are still living with trauma and conflict today. And loving our future neighbours, the next generation and generations beyond them, who will live a really challenging future as the climate crisis takes its toll and people fight for their very survival. So the word trenches as we remember the past. And here are some photos from the First and Second World Wars. All of us owe our security and our prosperity to those who sacrificed their lives back then. But as we look at these old photographs, it can feel a bit distant, can't it? Maybe we've had relatives who've lived through the horrors of the wars, but it's often the case that those who've lived through war and trauma don't want to talk about it much, or maybe they only have fragmented memories, a way of coping with the horror of what they've experienced. Just snapshot memories like the photographs that can only tell us part of the story. Here at St Mary's, we have a roll of honour commemorating those who died in the Great War. Up until now, it's simply been a list of names, but thanks to a local man, Alex Marker, who along with his dad, Brian, made it his lockdown project to research the history of each of the men who are named, we can begin to get a sense of the people behind the names. And we have this amazing collection of stories. Every one of those men, and it was men back then, are accounted for in this. And so I do encourage you to have a read of that. But I've asked Dave now to come and tell you the story about two neighbours who lived at numbers 4 and 5 Woodbine Cottages here in Norwood Green. Alfred Gardner and Charlie Pierce.
Two neighbours. Alfie Gardner lived at 4 Woodbine Cottages, Norwood Green. Next door at 5 lived Charlie Pierce. Woodbine Cottages were small, one up, one down cottages with outside toilets on Norwood Green Road, very near to St Mary's Church Hall and next to the still existing Woodbine Villas. The cottages were demolished in the late 1930s when, under the provisions of the 1930 Housing Act, they were deemed unfit for human habitation. We can therefore gather that neither Alfie nor Charlie were from exactly affluent backgrounds. Going back to the outbreak of World War I, in 1914, Alfie Gardner was 40 years old, married to Emma, with a daughter, Winifred, who was baptised right here at St Mary's, Norwood Green in June 1900. Alfie worked as a stoker at Southall Gasworks. Meanwhile, Charlie had also been baptised here at St Mary's in January 1895. But by the time war broke out, he'd already left the local area. Perhaps he didn't fancy following his dad into working at the massive Maypole margarine factory in Southall. Whatever, by the age of 17, in 1911, he'd signed up with the Royal Navy, boy, second class. And he was already, by the time war broke out, on his third ship and about to become an able seaman. By 2016, Charlie was serving on HMS Tipperary, which played a key role in the Battle of Jutland in the North Sea, the largest naval battle of World War I. In that battle, the Royal Navy Grand Fleet tried and eventually succeeded in preventing the German Navy from breaking out of the blockade of German ports. Both sides claimed victory, but in reality, nobody won. More than 6,000 British, more than 2,500 German sailors died. The Tipperary was trapped by a line of German ships which shelled her, and she sank with the loss of 185 crew, including able seaman Charlie Pierce, who died at 21. His body was never found. Meanwhile, Alfie started the war working in Southall Gasworks, but in 1915, still aged 40, he went to Hounslow and signed up as a driver for the Army Service Corps. He was posted to Alexandria in Egypt and thence to Greece, where he served for the rest of the war. At the beginning of September 2018, his daughter was married at St John's Southall, but Alfie was still in Greece. He never got to meet her husband. Though an armistice was signed and World War I ended in Greece at the end of September 2018, Alfie fell ill and he died on the 4th of November, aged 44. The record of his death describes it as caused by disease contracted on and aggravated by active service. He may well have been an early victim of the terrible flu pandemic of the period. He was buried, along with more than 1,800 other Commonwealth War dead, in the Thessaloniki Military Cemetery.
It's emotional, isn't it, hearing those stories come to life of real people. And each of their lives, the life of Alfred, the life of Charlie, and the lives of the millions killed in our conflict was precious, unique, and irreplaceable. The fact that these wars happened a long time ago makes it all the more important that we continue to remember the countless human experiences of the bravery, the sacrifice, and the anguish of war and violence. Alfred and Charlie gave their lives in a cause of justice and peace, and we can continue their legacy by being peacemakers ourselves. So we've remembered the past, and now we come to acknowledge the present impact of war. The trauma. At this very moment, across the world, war is a current reality for many. Here is a map of current conflict around the world. It is a really recent map. It's dated October 2021. And it shows combat-related deaths in the current or the past year. And it's a really shocking map. The areas of deep red indicate places where there have been 10,000 or more combat-related deaths. That's in the current or the past year. The bright red between 1,000 and 10,000. And just as sets of photographs cannot capture the whole story of the First and Second World Wars, the news reports of today can never tell the full story of what is happening in these situations of conflict and the human cost. Today, we remember people currently serving in our armed services. Let's hold in our prayers all of those who are living with deeply traumatic situations of conflict. Let's pray for the families and the individuals who are currently making treacherous journeys in search of safety. Let's commit ourselves to being good neighbours to people who are newly arrived in the UK to help them build a new life here. And I know that there are people from St Mary's who've been offering practical help. The Zealand Council has recently welcomed Afghan families relocating here. So we've looked at our neighbours in the past, we've looked at our neighbours in the present. And so what about the future? As we look to an uncertain future, one of the certainties is that there will continue to be wars. We heard this in the passage in Daniel. It was a difficult, apocalyptic piece of writing, but what did come through clearly was that the future is going to get messy. And in our gospel reading from Mark, we heard Jesus say, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines." There is an unfolding tragedy which has been spoken about powerfully at COP26. Because the changing climate is going to mean there will be competition to seize natural resources. There will be a growing risk of conflict over water and migration as people are displaced from land where conditions have become too extreme for them to be able to continue to live there. What actions can we, the people of St Mary's, Norwood Green, take to ensure that we're good neighbours to those who are already suffering the effects of an unstable climate? And what can we do now to ensure that we're good neighbours to future generations who will have to live on planet Earth? If you've been following the negotiations at COP26, you'll know that we need to take action to limit a rising temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this will need drastic action from our government, alongside the personal changes that we can each make to safeguard the future. Alongside all that we're doing with the Eco Church programme, we're going to have to look as a PCC in detail at how we can cut our carbon footprint to bring it in line with the Church of England goals for 2030. And there will be a cost to this, especially as we have to change our heating system. We've reflected on the sacrifice of those who lost their lives in the First and the Second World Wars to secure a better future for us. If we are going to be peacemakers, securing a better future for those who come after us, it is going to get uncomfortable. There are going to have to be sacrifices. We're not being asked to lose our lives, but we are being asked to lose our quality of life, to lay it down. Lay down the comfortable lifestyle that so many of us have become used to in the wealthier nations of the world. I've placed tragedy and triumph together because on Remembrance Sunday we gather in churches across the country, churches such as ours, and we place all of the stories of the trenches, the trauma and the tragedy into the context of the greater Christian story, of the suffering of Christ's crucifixion and the hope of resurrection. The Christian story recognises the reality of human suffering, but it also teaches us that violence and sacrifice don't have the last word. It does not end there. In the Old Testament passage from Daniel, we heard we can expect life to get messy and difficult, but God is going to have the last word. As we look with realism to an uncertain future with the changes in climate, we need to hold on to a bigger picture, because we can look beyond the tragedy to eventual triumph. The tragedy of Jesus' death was our making, but it wasn't the end. And in ways we cannot fully understand, we never will be able to, God will have the last word. Let me remind you again of Jesus' words. When you hear of wars and rumours of wars, do not be alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places and famines. These are the beginning of birth pains. Yes, we need to respond to trauma and tragedy by faithfully pouring ourselves out for the victims. But what we don't need to be is alarmed as we face that uncertain future, because God is with us and Jesus reassures us that these are birth pains towards something better. God will have the last word. The Bible tells us that in the future, when there will be a time of no more crying, no more pain, and creation itself will be renewed. So to my final slide. On this Remembrance Sunday, we've remembered the past and the trenches and the wars, the trauma that many people live with still in the present. And in a week of unsatisfactory climate pledges, we will think of the tragedy that's unfolding ahead of us. But this is also a service of communion, which is in itself an act of remembrance. And the Eucharist is where the tragedy, the trenches, and the trauma come together. God knows the whole of our lives, not just the snapshot moments that we let the people around us see. And he will welcome us with love as we come to this communion table, bringing our own messy lives, including the trauma and the tragedy and our fears for the future. As you receive the bread and the wine in remembrance of his death and resurrection, know that Jesus' love, that is stronger than death, has the last word. Eat and drink and taste this reality that God has the last word.